little bit behind schedule is let's begin the actual lectures themselves. And then feel free also, if you have questions, interrupt me. I tend to speak fast with American English, which I know is not, we're not all native English speakers here. So especially when I get passionate about things, feel free to remind me, hey, can you repeat that or slow down? And also at the end, we'll have time for questions and debate. I'm assuming you won't agree with everything I present. I'm hoping we can really get some discussion and debate going on these issues. So let's begin with the first lecture. Everything is okay with the camera, Corbett? Okay. So ladies and gentlemen, I would like to share with you a few reflections now on the topic, the history and the theory of cultural diplomacy. This is a big topic to try to wrap up into a 45 minutes lecture. But what I want to try to do is touch on at least the key aspects. Where did cultural diplomacy come from? When did it begin? What are the main periods of its developments up until now? And what are we talking about when we talk about, let's say, new school cultural diplomacy, or the cultural diplomacy of the future? So let's begin, first of all, with the definition. It's still very difficult for me to find a perfect definition for cultural diplomacy. This coming definition is one that I like, even though I recognize its imperfection and it doesn't work in all times and spaces around the world. It's a definition from Milton Cummings. Milton Cummings is a political scientist based in the US. This definition was published in a book of one of our board members, Cynthia Schneider. She's the former US ambassador to the Netherlands under the Clinton administration, as well as a tenured professor of art history for many years at Georgetown before she was ambassador, and now actually a professor of cultural diplomacy at Georgetown. So again, a woman who really knows this in the theory and the practice. This is also her preferred definition. And I'll read it to you and then I'll tell you why I like it. Cultural diplomacy, the exchange of ideas, information, art, and other aspects of culture among nations and their peoples to foster mutual understanding. So the first thing I like about this is exchange. I think cultural diplomacy is always some sort of an exchange. Very rarely is it a one-way street where someone tries to project a certain image or message. Ideally, at its best, cultural diplomacy is always an exchange. It goes in at least two directions, if not more. So here again, he's very broad. It can be any kind of an exchange, information, art, other aspects of culture. That's the first thing that I think is important when we talk about cultural diplomacy. Second thing, target audience, among nations and their peoples. So this doesn't have to be country to country, as classically is thought. In the past, cultural diplomacy was always governmental, and it was always one country presenting itself in another country. What I hope we'll find out this morning, and also through the course of the week, it can also be people to people. And in fact, these citizen forms of cultural diplomacy, when it's citizen to citizen, very often are even more effective than the governmental, again, depending on the context and the setting. So that's the second point I like about this definition. He's again broad. So nations and their peoples. So he's really allowing for also private sector, public sector, and civil society participation, which we would argue at the Institute is key for the future of cultural diplomacy. Third thing I like about this definition is the goal. What is this all about? It's about mutual understanding. So it's not about persuasion or propaganda or this and that, but somehow we're trying to achieve a mutual understanding. At ICD, we would go further and say really cultural diplomacy, when it's successful, would lead to dialogue, understanding, and trust. And I think there for us, trust is the key. That's really at the Institute where we would say cultural diplomacy would stop and the other actors can then actually begin their work. So if cultural diplomacy can get us to the point where we trust each other, doesn't mean we agree with each other, doesn't even mean we like each other, but at least trust each other, then business is possible, peace treaties are possible, cooperation is possible, everything. And that's then up to the governments and the citizens to do what they want. But let's say the goal of the work of the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy, as an example of cultural diplomacy, would be how do we educate, enhance, and sustain relationships with the goal of building dialogue, understanding, and trust. So that's another way we can wrap ourselves around this definition. How do we educate, enhance, and sustain the relationships with the ultimate goal of trust? So again, that would be at least a starting point for us and as we begin our conversation on cultural diplomacy. I'll make reference to this definition later today and also this week, and I'm sure you have your own feedback on this definition. I'd love to hear from you later too if there are other definitions that you find helpful as we discuss cultural diplomacy. So before I give you, let's say, the historical overview, there are 4 points that I want to draw your attention to. These are what I call the 4 key components of cultural diplomacy, or it's kind of my checklist when I evaluate different examples of cultural diplomacy to try to evaluate, is it successful or is it helpful or not? There are kind of 4 questions that I ask myself. First of all, what is the agenda of the cultural diplomacy? What are they trying to do? Are they trying to get us to or convince us of something? Are they trying to get our cooperation? Is British Council just trying to tell us how great British culture is? What is the agenda at the end of the day? Not always easy to find out, but we have to try to get clarity there. So that's the first question that I always ask myself. Second question, who is the agent? In the sense British Council. Is it governmental? Is it non-governmental? Is it for-profit? Is it non-for-profit? We have to try to get clarity. Who is the agent actually doing the culture diplomacy? Again, not always easy. As we'll see later on, British Council, again, I'm taking this example kind of randomly, technically is a non-governmental organization. On the other hand, over half of their budget comes from the government. So what do we make of that? Is it really non-governmental? Is it governmental? These are questions we have to try to answer. So that would be the second point. Third point, what is the vehicle of culture diplomacy? How are they doing it? Are they sending jazz musicians? Is it academic exchange programs? Are they hosting concerts? What is the mechanism or what is the vehicle of how they're actually doing the culture diplomacy? We've seen many different vehicles in the 20th century and beyond, and I'm hoping this week you'll maybe even learn of some new vehicles or examples that you maybe didn't know before coming here. Final point we just discussed in the definition, target audience. This is really a key point for cultural diplomats to really think about seriously, because a problem very often in the field of cultural diplomacy is you preach to the choir. In the sense, maybe what's happening right now, in the sense everybody who came here this week, you're coming here because you are interested in cultural diplomacy, you are interested in learning about other cultures, you are interested in actually probably strengthening relationships around the world. So for you, it's great, and I think there I'm hoping we can really have a multiplier effect with you after this week. On the other hand, you actually don't need this. In the sense, really the people who need culture diplomacy the most, or let's say the more urgently, are those who aren't so interested in other cultures, those who aren't interested in culture diplomacy, those maybe who prefer hard power options or military options, those who are maybe more focused on trade and not so focused on culture. So target audience is really important in the sense, how do we reach the firefighters, the nurses, and the high school teachers of the countries that we're dealing with? Not only the academic elites or the political elites. How do we reach those who maybe are actually opposed to the methods of culture diplomacy and really prefer other methods, which have benefits and disadvantages? So that's always something that we're thinking about. We just did a big conference in the USA, and one of my main areas of focus there was actually Republicans. In the sense, traditionally, Democrats tend to be a little bit closer to culture diplomacy, these kinds of events. So we made it a big point to really, we invited both Democrats and Republicans, but in particular Republicans. We had Secretary Michael Chertoff, who's the former Secretary of Homeland Security under Bush. So he actually wrote the Patriot Act with Bush. So really, a hard power guy in the best sense of the word, talking about culture diplomacy. And so that's important for us. We had some lieutenant generals, we had some from the military. So always to try to think, how do we avoid just preaching to the choir? The choir is great, but we also need other partners to make this long-term a success. So those are 4 points I would just suggest that you have as a kind of a checklist as we go through the other lectures in the program. Agenda, agent, vehicle, and target audience. So keep that as a reference point. And now I'd like to begin a little bit with the historical chronology of culture diplomacy. So first of all, I'm grouping together a number of different kinds of culture diplomacy as to what I call positive or classical culture diplomacy. Later on, I'll talk to you about what I call negative culture diplomacy. But this is really, I think, that in the sense, positive classical culture diplomacy was really when culture diplomacy began. So I give you a brief timeline here. It's not an exhaustive timeline, but I've just given you a few examples that I want to discuss for a variety of reasons. First of all, technically, the oldest cultural diplomacy institution is the Alliance Française. So in 1883, that's the first sort of institution that was made with the goal of actually doing cultural diplomacy. As we all know, however, France was busy with a number of things in this time period, in particular also their colonial empire. And in many ways, Alliance Française didn't actually, in my opinion, serve as really building understanding and trust. But it was very much, how do we really bring French culture abroad? And sometimes not even getting people attracted to the culture, but even pushing it on them, as we know in the case of Africa, etc. But in essence, trying to be objective, I think the goal of Alliance Française was to really make, French culture more accessible to the world. So you may have noticed around the corner from ICD is the Alliance Française, Institut Français, Cinéma de Paris. So it's a whole building that the French government pays for, and they have a movie theater there where you can see French movies. You can take French classes there. They do exhibitions with photos, paintings, etc. They have lectures there, readings, all kinds of activities. So the idea is let's bring French culture closer to the people in that sense. So, okay. Hold on 1 second. A brief interruption here. 1 second. All right, just give it back to me later. Okay. So speaking of trust with colleagues, so all right, so we'll come back here. Sorry about the brief interruption. Okay, so coming back to the Alliance Française. So essentially, again, in a positive way, the French are trying to bring their culture to Germans. So let's make it easier for Germans to get to know France. So offer French classes, bring your movies, bring your music, etc. So that's why I'm calling this positive. Negative, as I'll come to later, is when governments or institutions make it more difficult for exchange to take place. But in this case, again, we're in an objective way. That's really the initial goal of Alliance Française, to help bring French culture abroad, make it easier for people to access. In some countries, it's called Institut Français. Some countries, Alliance Française, more or less the same institution. There have been different periods of its evolution over time. In New York, for example, it's actually one organization called the French Institut Alliance Française, all housed together. Here in Berlin, you have also the Cinéma de Paris in addition to that, and the Maison de France. So in different countries, it's somewhat different mixtures, but I would generalize by saying more or less the goal of each one of those institutions is to bring French culture abroad, make it easier for people to access. Governmentally funded. Obviously, there's a link to the governmental agenda. The main vehicle, as I said, is movies, teaching language courses, music concerts, lectures, poetry readings, exhibitions, etc. So really every way they can trying to bring French culture abroad. In terms of the target audience, again, it's hard to generalize, but I think it tends to be what I would classify more of an elite group, in the sense that people who will go see these movies on Kurfürstendamm and the Cinéma de Paris probably aren't the best cross-section of really Berliners or Germans. I don't think it's blocked. I mean, I think if somebody wanted to come from a totally other part of town, etc., of course they'd be welcome to. But if you look at their marketing strategy, it is very much linked to the embassy, and very much the embassy is involved also in choosing the guests, especially for openings of movies, etc. So a little bit on the elitist side, but in essence is open, and I think anyone can actually go there and take a course. I think it's a little bit more expensive than some of the other options for courses, which also limits, I think, a little bit the people who actually go and take courses there, as opposed to another language school that's maybe free or less expensive. Second example that I wanted to give you is Deutsche Welle. Which is a German example. So in 1924, Deutsche Welle was born. First of all, anyone here know what Deutsche Welle is, or do we have any volunteers? Someone who's maybe experienced Deutsche Welle? I'm sure somebody here has. You're coming from an international group. Okay, what is Deutsche Welle?
No, I only had a small experience because the basic German I was learning was through a program that they did, like an online language learning program. It was supported by that.
Okay. So one example of the way you got to know them is learning the German language through an online course. Anyone else? What is Deutsche Welle? All right, yeah? Up there. So we'll start in the back and we'll come to the front. Yeah? Yeah. Radio, yes. Okay. So websites, radio, and TV. But what is it? Or can you? Yeah? Yeah. Okay. All right, so briefly what Deutsche Welle is it's a media organization that expresses itself three ways: TV, radio, and internet. TV, it's actually the fourth largest international news broadcaster in the world. So number one is CNN, then Al Jazeera, then BBC, then Al Jazeera, and then Deutsche Welle. So in terms of magnitude, it's actually quite big in terms of its reach. So basically the idea is to provide news from Germany, but actually international news around the world. TV they offer in 4 languages, possibly 5, as far as I know. Radio, I believe, is 30 languages, if not 31. I think they're also doing more and more. Internet is also, I think, 30 or 31 languages. So essentially, it's a news broadcaster or a media organization coming from Germany. Their agenda, technically speaking, is really to provide news to the world. However, the agent is actually governmental. So Deutsche Welle technically is non-governmental, and if you go to their webpage, it says they're non-governmental. But I think it's 99%, if not 100% of their budget does actually come from the German government. The foreign ministry, the federal government, there are a number of different agencies, but government money. And the interesting thing is also in terms of how it's broadcast around the world. Now, not too many here knew Deutsche Welle, but does anyone maybe can take a guess? If we wanted to watch Deutsche Welle TV right now, what number would it be on the TV? For example, ARD is number 1, the ZDF is number 2 in Germany. Anyone have an idea what number is Deutsche Welle if we wanted to watch it? Anyone make a guess maybe? Or? It's too bad. Do we have any Germans in the room? Or? We have one. All right. Okay, so I think you may have seen my trick question. You actually can't watch it in Germany, so it's not broadcast here. So it's only broadcast outside of Germany. So it's sort of a unique example where basically they're only interested in broadcasting outside of Germany in a variety of languages. So I think there are many Germans when traveling will turn into Deutsche Welle and kind of get a link to Germany, German news. But since it's broadcast in other languages, they're really trying to reach other target audiences. So this is for me kind of my dilemma with Deutsche Welle in the sense it's governmentally funded, technically non-governmental, broadcast only outside of Germany. And so Germans don't even watch it. And so the question is, what do we make of that? And I think for me, a little bit of the challenge is obviously there's the risk there that maybe you're going to be doing something that's more closely linked to the governmental interests. I've had many conversations with Deutsche Welle. We know many of their journalists. Some of them are actually on our advisory board. I know also quite well Christoph Lanz, who's actually the director of Deutsche Welle TV. And he's told me on a number of occasions, he doesn't consider it propaganda. However, his job at the end of the day is to present more of a positive image of Germany than a negative. And I think there where you notice that is in terms of the choice of articles and stories. So they have more stories about maybe design or literature, kind of the good life, less stories about immigration problems or integration problems in Berlin-Kreuzberg. So I think there, I don't want to criticize Deutsche Welle because in many ways they do great work, but I think that model does need to be revisited in terms of how that works. I think if they, for example, broadcasted in Germany, they would gain more legitimacy. If they mixed the funding also, allowing some private sector funding, et cetera, that would also, I think, benefit them in terms of giving them even more authenticity and more neutrality. On the other hand, in certain parts of the world where this is broadcast, they're very neutral compared to the alternatives. Obviously, some parts of the world where you have censorship, et cetera, this is a great option and a very neutral option compared to the alternatives. So again, it's relative, but it's an interesting example, again, what I would call positive classical cultural diplomacy, because in a sense they're trying to bring German news or German stories or German information to the rest of the world in a positive way. So that would be the second example that I'll give you in our sort of historical chronology. The next two examples we can more or less group together, British Council and the Goethe Institute, because they're very similar to Alliance Française. So British Council and the questions I can go into a little bit more detail if you'd like, but essentially, in different foreign countries of the world, capital cities usually, you've got the building of the British Council. Most of those countries, they have also a media center downstairs, which is open to the public. You can read British newspapers, very often have also multimedia opportunities there, screens, TVs, etc. You can learn English there. They teach English in most countries. And also they do events similar to Alliance Française, where they'll do a lecture or other events dealing with European topics or British topics, etc. What's interesting about the British Council, they've recently shifted their strategy for Europe, where they basically said, okay, Europe doesn't need us, in the sense we've got Britain's Got Talents and EasyJet and this and that. Do we really need to be spending money to bring British culture abroad, also in terms of language? So they said, all right, let's downsize in Europe and put more resources in other parts of the world, which is on the one hand, I think, makes perfect sense. On the other hand, it does pose the question to us, is cultural diplomacy needed with our friends and with our partners? In the sense, was it a good decision, for example, at the end of the Cold War when the Americans said, okay, mission accomplished. There's no more need for cultural diplomacy in Germany. Let's close all the America houses. Let's close a lot of the cultural diplomacy initiatives. Germany, of course, they're going to like us. Of course, they're going to agree with us, whatever we want. Second World War, German Marshall Plan, etc. And many really felt, as if the United States kind of turned off the light switch on the cultural diplomacy for Germany. As we saw not too long ago, especially under the Bush administration, there was a lot of disagreement between Germany and the USA. Germany didn't always, do what the USA wanted, and in many ways, you really saw a weak point in that relationship. I think it was the final couple years of the Bush administration. They did a poll of positive opinion of the USA in Iran and in Germany. Iran, I think, was 22% positive opinion of the USA. Germany was 8%. So that time was really a weak point. Obviously, that had a lot to do with the foreign policy of the US at the time. That doesn't necessarily mean Germans didn't like Americans, but it is an indication that actually we need to think about this, that also amongst our friends, amongst our partners, I would argue cultural diplomacy is also necessary. Maybe a different kind of cultural diplomacy, maybe one should be more creative there, but again, even the British-German relationship, on the one hand, it's great, European Union, on the other hand, it's terrible, European Union, etc. How many British are against European Union, this and that? So I think there would be a need there for something. I'm posing this as a question for you that we can think about this week. Is cultural diplomacy needed only when you have problems between countries, or also where you have, let's say, good partners and friends? The next example, Goethe Institute, Again, more or less the same format as British Council. Goethe Institute began after the Second World War, 1951. And what's interesting about Goethe Institute, we'll deal with this a little bit later in the week. Germany, since the Second World War, has been really dedicated to soft power and to cultural diplomacy. And to fast forward up until today, Germany actually spends more money on cultural diplomacy than political diplomacy. So the cultural part of the German Foreign Office actually has a bigger budget than the political part. And I think that's the only country in the world that I know of where that's the case. The Americans, it's 1% of the healthcare budget of the defense budget is actually what they spend on culture. It's nothing. But for the Germans, on the one hand, for obvious reasons, since the end of the Second World War. On the other hand, I think for maybe less obvious reasons, I think Germany really believes, all right, this is the long-term strategy. Let's invest in culture. Let's invest in academic exchange, etc. And really, in doing so, we can build relationships and partnerships that we can prosper from down the road. And I think now, just look at Germany in terms of the economics is really the giant of Europe. In terms of culture, one of the most active when it comes to culture diplomacy. So I'll just point out in the broader framework in which Goethe Institute is sitting is quite interesting. And I'll mention, when I talk about New School cultural diplomacy, a few other examples of German cultural diplomacy. But Goethe Institute began in 1951. Again, similar format to British Council. You have a building in other countries of the world where you can learn German. They do German events, etc., basically bringing German culture abroad. So the government basically says, this is our job, in the sense. We should take taxpayers' euros or money every year and spend it to actually bring our culture abroad. Again, very different from the American approach, where the American government says, hey, it's for the private sector. Sell your Hollywood movies, sell your Starbucks. That's not the business of the government, that's the private sector. So really a hands-off approach. And we can debate if that's good or bad, but I think this is a question that we'll struggle with the whole week. Should governments be involved in cultural diplomacy? If so, how should they be involved? Should they be deciding for us which cultural elements they bring abroad? Should they just be facilitating access? Or how can we put together the role of the public sector, private sector, and civil society? So these are, again, I'm giving you questions to jot down and we can think about throughout the other sessions. Last example I want to mention to you is the Japan Foundation, which we'll spend more time on later this week. But just to point out to you what I find interesting about the Japan Foundation, in the 1970s, Japan didn't actually have cultural diplomacy, and they didn't have a civil society. So really from scratch, they created both. And it's kind of a unique situation where that happens, kind of out of the blue, where a government says, all right, we need to do this. And they started the Japan Foundation. It was actually a combination of public and private sector money. But we'll go more into detail of that later. But that's the one thing that's very important. Really, cultural diplomacy was basically started from scratch in the 70s. And then second point, which we'll also come back to later, is civil society, where it was actually a top-down approach from Japan, where the government actually gave money to individuals, basically, to start NGOs. Very different way of starting civil society than in the US. In the USA, there's really the idea citizens are coming together to help citizens. As you all know, especially recently with the news with the new health plan of Obama, traditionally speaking, the American government does relatively little for its citizens compared to Germany or France, where you have healthcare, retirement, the works, and Americans pay much less taxes. So meaning there are many problems where the government actually isn't helping. And that was really, in my opinion, where civil society was born. That basically you had citizens coming together saying, hey, look, we can wait a long time for the government to come and make a homeless shelter, or we can make a charity ourselves and do it ourselves. And really this idea of citizens coming together through their own contributions and sacrifice to actually make contributions for other citizens. And as you look at Greenpeace, Amnesty International, all these NGOs basically started that way, really grassroots, people coming together to help other people. So we'll come back to that later when we talk about civil society, but those are two things that are unique about the Japan Foundation. The mission of the Japan Foundation is also a little bit more modern than the others, where it's really about two-way exchange. It's really about also building understanding and trust between Japan and its neighbors. It's not just about promoting Japan abroad. So I think since they started a little bit later, they had a chance to also learn from maybe some of the mistakes of other countries that had been made earlier. So this is just a very brief overview of what I'm calling classical cultural diplomacy. So really where governments were pretty much the leaders, and the main goal was more or less, how do we win the hearts and minds of foreign audiences? How do we make others like our culture or like our country more, through our language, through our great cultural events, etc. So that would be the brief overview of what I call positive classical cultural diplomacy. Let me give you one example of this, which is one of my favorite examples. I wrote my thesis actually in Paris on cultural diplomacy and jazz. Many of you may have heard of the jazz ambassadors. During the Cold War period, this is really where, in many ways, cultural diplomacy was born. Again, we'll go more into detail on this in the other lectures. But just as a brief overview, this is a song actually that Louis Armstrong sung. He didn't actually write it, but it summarizes more or less the goal of the American government during the Cold War period. The State Department has discovered jazz. It teaches folks like nothing ever has. Like when they feel that jazzy rhythm, they know we're really with them. That's what we call cultural exchange. No commodity is quite so strange as this thing called cultural exchange. And I'll show you a brief video clip of Louis Armstrong. So just imagine you're sitting in Moscow in the middle of the Cold War. You think whatever you think about the United States. And instead of hearing some boring gray-haired politician coming up and giving you a speech and telling you how great the US is, you were to experience something like this. Oh, is the sound off?
I see trees of green, red roses too. I see them blue for me and you. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world.
So I'll stop it there, but and again, I can go more in detail on this later if you like. But what's fascinating about the jazz ambassadors is a number of things. First of all, again, this idea where really the Americans and the Soviets also at that time were really thinking hard, all right, how do we attract people? It was really in many ways a battle of minds, just as much as a battle of actually hard power tactics. I mean, you had this hard power threat in the background of mutual mass destruction, but that really allowed for the soft power to take place. And so one of the goals was, all right, how do we attract people? And there was a lot of thought given, first of all, to should it be music or should it be other forms? And they decided music was one of the most successful forms for cultural diplomacy. Secondly, jazz was also not a coincidence. For many people, jazz at the time was really, it was a modern music. It was a music that really represented freedom for many people. It allowed for improvisation, like really no other music form had beforehand. So really the music itself also meant a lot. And I think listening to jazz music during occupied France or during the Cold War period did actually have a very unique meaning. Later on, rock and roll was also used for cultural diplomacy. One of our advisory board members, András Simeoni, the former Hungarian ambassador to the US, has spoken very eloquently about as he was a kid growing up in communist Hungary, rock and roll had more of an impact on him than politics in terms of really shaping who he is, giving him really vision also in terms of the kind of a world he wanted to live in the future. So music itself can be very powerful. At the time, jazz was really the music to have done that. The other point was also primarily African-American musicians that they would send. And this was, again, part of the strategy, where I think they were trying to present maybe a somewhat false image of the progress that the U.S. had made. As we know at the time, there still were, and unfortunately still today, big issues of actually segregation, racism, etc. But they were trying to show, at least through these jazz ambassadors, hey, we've actually overcome, and look how modern and free we are, even sending African-American jazz musicians. So again, it's kind of the mistake that many people make when they see Obama as president. They say, good, that means, battle is won, and no more problems with racism, etc. in the USA. Unfortunately, it's not so easy, but just to let you know, there was a lot of thought given in this. They were really trying to give, a very certain image of the U.S., really a clean image, a modern image, an image of freedom, an image of success. And even the words, the song here, What a Wonderful World, again, this is not a coincidence that they're choosing songs like that. So again, this is really a great example of this classical cultural diplomacy, cultural diplomacy in its finest from the point of view of governmental propaganda or persuasion, or winning the hearts and minds of foreign audiences. I'll show you a brief clip of an interview with Louis Armstrong that was done shortly before he went to Moscow, again, just to give you a feeling for this different kind of ambassador representing the USA abroad.
I understand, Louis, you've become quite a favorite of the royal family. How do you feel about that?
Oh, they're all cats,
They're all cats. Sachko, I believe you once expressed a desire to play behind the Iron Curtain, maybe in Russia itself. Have you any plans along that line now?
Well, now it's up to Uncle Sam, because getting a little rough over there, and unless they say go, I don't think we'd just deliberately go over there, But, I mean, you see the trumpet just blow. They don't care where it plays. I mean, they just know that if it plays right, it's going to be appreciated in any language. Fine. So if the Uncle Sam say go over there tomorrow, I mean, we're right there and way over them cats. Might stop all that ringing and twisting.
I recall on a recent trip to England, Louis, you kind of shattered protocol by saying you were going to lay a song on for Princess Margaret. Now, what was the princess's reaction to that?
Well, when we laid that mahogany hall stuff on her, she didn't be bothered with nobody. She just put her hand on her knee and dug that jive. That's it.
How did the crowd react, Louis?
Oh, well, man, they didn't even disturb her, They just thrilled. And the house came down, you know.
The house came down.
That she had such.
So I'll stop it there. But again, this is a fascinating example of cultural diplomacy being used during the Cold War period. Just to summarize, at the end of the Cold War, I mean, Joseph Nye, you may all know this professor from Harvard University who coined the term soft power, as well as the recent term smart power. In Joseph Nye's opinion, he says really the success of the Cold War was a success of smart power, really this combination of hard and soft power. And when the Berlin Wall came down, it didn't come down by bombs and missiles and tanks, but it came down by private citizens with hammers and chisels who wanted to get to the other side. They were attracted to one way of life, so to speak, or let's say disillusioned with another way. So in that sense, Joseph Nye would say this was soft power. This was also cultural diplomacy, this power of attraction. So again, we have to ask ourselves, though, would this work today? In the sense, if the American government were to send jazz musicians to Iraq or Afghanistan, is that really going to help to build understanding and trust? And I would be skeptical there. However, I'll show you in the second part of the second lecture an example of actually where Secretary of State Clinton is actually still using music to try to build bridges. But again, let's keep this in the historical context of the Cold War, where many do see that it was a success. What I'd like to do now is discuss briefly what I call negative cultural diplomacy. You could also call it negative cultural policy, being a little bit loose with the term diplomacy here. But again, this is another option that governments have when it comes to their cultural strategies. The one idea, as I said before, in terms of positive cultural diplomacy is let's promote our culture abroad. Let's make it easier for people to access our culture abroad. The opposite of that is what I'm calling negative cultural diplomacy, when you can also make it more difficult for people to influence your culture or access your culture, or the other way around. One example of that is the Académie Française, which is an institution based in Paris, not a cultural diplomacy institution, but an institution where one of their main tasks is to maintain the purity of the French language. So basically their job is blocking foreign influences. So whether it's American words, etc., one of their main tasks is to really block influence from other cultures, or let's say exchange from other cultures when it comes to the language. And also in some cases to make up new words that sound more French. If there's a new word, let's say from the United States, email, for example, don't call it an email, call it a courriel or a courrier électronique. So again, I'm presenting it in a provocative way, but that's their job. So basically people with full-time salaries sitting there all day with the main task of actually blocking influence to the French language and making sure it stays pure. Something that's great, and you could say the French language is actually purer than maybe any other language in the world. The Germans very often complain. The German language now, you don't know if they're speaking German or English. You have so many English words that are in there, which is on the one hand a loss, because obviously our culture is an important part of our language is an important part of our culture. So I'm not saying this is bad culture diplomacy, but it's negative in the sense that there's a blocking going on. A better example of what I'm calling negative culture diplomacy is the quotas on the radio. I was shocked when I was an exchange student in Paris. This is back in 97, 98. There was a very high quota on the radio. At that time, I believe it was 70% of the music on the French radio needed to be in French, and only 30% could be from other countries or other languages. And this was actually a law. I mean, if you didn't abide by this, you would be fined, and there were criminal procedures that would come. And I was shocked, as an American, that this is possible. I mean, if I were to imagine President Obama coming on the radio tomorrow and saying, "My fellow Americans, I'm very proud to announce that Congress just passed a new bill. In the United States, 80% of the music on the radio needs to be in English, 20% can be in Spanish and other languages." We'd have a civil war. How dare the government come and try to actually censor the radio or control, how much is in one language or the other. I think Americans, we would demand, total freedom there. If we want to listen to Spanish or Italian or German music, let us. And you don't need to tell us how much is possible. So I think it's impossible to imagine such a law in the context of the US. Whereas for France, for a long time, it's the norm. Also, actually, in Brussels, there's been legislation recently passed. So actually, Germany has a quota as well. I think it's maybe 20% of the music needs to be in German on the radio. And I have mixed feelings there. On the one hand, I feel it kind of goes against the principles of cultural diplomacy to sort of to limit or to block or to censor, or that the government should somehow intervene and decide for us, how much foreign music is good for us and how much is bad for us. On the other hand, I appreciated it when I came to Germany to do research, actually, after my time in France. And I really wanted to get to know German culture. So I came here, I wanted to learn the German language, German culture, etc. Turned on my radio the first day, I really wanted to listen to German music. And I was going American music, Italian music. It was very difficult for me to find German music on the radio. And I said, all right, let me go see a good German movie. So I went to the movie theaters here in the center of Berlin. Same problem. Hollywood, 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 maybe a French movie. And if you looked hard, you could find maybe 1 or 2 German movies. And that was where I began to think, okay, maybe the French are onto something. Unless one does something or takes some measure, there is this risk of cultural imperialism of the United States or imperialisme culturel des États-Unis. And maybe some sort of a balancing is necessary there to make sure there's more of an even playing field. So again, I'm not saying bad cultural diplomacy, but negative cultural diplomacy in the sense it's about blocking or about limiting or making it more difficult for certain exchanges to take place. And again, as I said, you could substitute the word diplomacy for policy, what is the cultural policy of a country. But I wanted to at least express this to you as another option that countries have and also cultural diplomats have. It's not just about making it easier to access cultures, but it can also be about making it more difficult to access certain cultures by quotas or by censoring the language, etc. So that would be another example. And there are many other, we could talk also about China. We're going to talk later this week where there are many other challenges along these lines. But those are just 2 examples to outline what I'm calling negative classical cultural diplomacy. Now, the final thing that I'd like to talk to you about is new school cultural diplomacy, where I'm actually going to give a older example as well as a newer example, if my computer cooperates, which it does not seem to be. Excuse me 1 second here. Nothing. Strange, right? No. Let's see how to unplug it. All right, I think I'll need to do a restart here. So maybe what we can do is take a few questions while this is restarting 1 second. Let me just make sure this is working and then I'll come back to you. Okay. So it's restarting. So before I talk about new school culture diplomacy, I'd be happy to take questions or comments maybe from you regarding what I've presented so far, which is more old school culture diplomacy, or let's say the classical forms of culture diplomacy. Any questions or comments regarding that? And if so, we have the microphone also. Yeah, okay. Okay. Well,
If it wasn't misunderstood, you were in D.C., correct? In Washington, D.C.?
I was 2 weeks ago. We did a conference there. Yeah.
Okay. Who has a more proactive approach towards cultural diplomacy? Would it be the conservatives or the liberals? Would you know?
Oh, in the USA?
Yes.
It's hard to say because they're actually, I mean, traditionally speaking, I think, if you look at the different administrations, Clinton, for example, did a lot when it came to cultural diplomacy at the big cultural diplomacy initiative at the White House. The previous Bush administration was not known for, let's say soft power or talking or negotiating, was more about the hard power approach. So I hate to generalize, but I think traditionally speaking, I think there's been more initiatives maybe from the Democratic side when it comes to cultural diplomacy. On the other hand, now many argue the Defense Department is actually doing better cultural diplomacy than actually the State Department. And in that sense, very often also the Defense Departments, and whether it's soldiers abroad, etc. There have actually been some very positive examples where they're actually representing our culture abroad, in uniform. So it's hard to say. And again, people like Chertoff, who gave some really excellent addresses about really how he sees the vital importance of balancing the hard and the soft power. The current administration is the best example, where I think Obama, through his speeches and also through many of the initiatives, really is trying to show, this is more about listening than it is speaking. This is more about a two-way street, about really respecting the other cultures. I still would have loved him to do more, but I think I also give him credit in the sense he began this job with such a burden on his back in terms of, economic crisis, military overstretch, etc. So we haven't seen in substance so much. But you will see an example in the second lecture of some initiatives that the State Department is doing today. So I'm kind of trying to avoid answering your question totally, to stay nonpartisan and objective. But in essence, you could actually say all of the administrations have been very weak since the Cold War. And really in the Cold War period, cultural diplomacy was very important. You had a lot of initiatives, a lot of money spent. Essentially, that was the breaking point. At the end of the Cold War, the Americans said, okay, no more need. more or less, and they really shifted everything into the State Department. They closed the United States Information Service, closed all the America houses abroad, and really did downsize. So that would be maybe the more useful breaking point to look at the end of the Cold War. I don't think it's such a partisan issue, and my hope, and maybe I'm naive in this, but it really is that Republicans and Democrats do see, especially after September 11th, etc., the vital importance of this cultural dimension. It's not just about the politics and the economics anymore. So wait and see. I think there we have a chance in the current administration, maybe also regarding the second term, then maybe it'll be easier when we're not fighting such big fires as economic crisis and this and that to hopefully do more sustainable work. So I'm kind of avoiding your question, but answering it partially as well. I've also been here for the last 12 years, so you might actually be better suited to answer that question than me. As an American in background, I've been living here for 12 years. In the meantime, it looks like we do have success with the computer. It's very odd, actually. I'm usually a big Mac proponent and saying how great Apples are, but maybe I overworked it. So let's come back here to the history, and I'll show you the final points. So where were we here? New school culture diplomacy. So I want to give you two examples, maybe three, of what I would call new school culture diplomacy. First of all, I want to discuss this issue of access. Again, speaking of the USA, I always make reference to one of my classmates in college, Lauryn Hill, who also studied at Columbia University. Many of you know her. She's a famous singer from the Fugees and beyond. And while she was in college, before she dropped out, when she became very famous, she started an NGO called the Refugee Project. And Lauryn's main thesis is that the main, let's say, divisive force in the world between human beings wasn't race or ethnicity or nationality or gender or any of the issues we typically look to as sort of the dividing lines. She said for her, the main difference between human beings in the world is access. Some people in the world have access to what they want and what they need. Some people don't have access. That could be access to human rights, access to food, access to peace, access to education, access to all kinds of things. And that was the filter that she used to look at sort of the problems of the world. And I like that filter, because if you look at it that way, it's actually easier. In a sense, we have enough money in the world, we have enough food in the world, we have enough peace in the world. It really is just a matter of facilitating access. And that actually should be the job of local, national, and regional governments. In a sense, technically, that should be what they're doing, is actually saying, all right, this is what my citizens want and need, let me see how I can get it for them. So if you agree that that's, let's say, the main problem in the world, really this issue of access, I think it also applies for cultural diplomacy, where I think, again, it's not for us at the Institute so important to say, French culture is great, or American culture is great, or here's the nation brand of my country, here's the nation brand of your country. Not really propaganda persuasion. But I would say new school cultural diplomacy should be about facilitating access. In a sense, give people the chance to figure out for themselves what your country is like or what your culture is like, getting to know your citizens, getting to know your culture really firsthand. And they can make up their own minds. And in the end, maybe they won't like everything about your culture, maybe they will. But in the end, if the goal is building trust, I think you're going to come closer to trusting someone if you can really see both sides. If I'm trying to gain your trust and I just tell you how great I am and I tell you about all of my successes, probably that's not going to lead you to necessarily trust me. Whereas if I come to you and I say, look, here are my strengths, here are my weaknesses, here are my successes, here are my failures, then I think we have an easier starting point to build trust. So I think that's one of the big shifts that I've seen from what I'm calling old school cultural diplomacy with new school cultural diplomacy. I would argue new school cultural diplomacy should be about facilitating access, and that's it, and not necessarily controlling the access or trying to give a certain image or a certain, let's say, view of a country or a culture, just facilitating the access. One older example of this is actually 1925, a German example. In German, they call it the Deutsche Akademische Austauschdienst, or the German Academic Exchange Service. The reason why I'm singling this out, obviously there are many exchange programs in the world, Fulbright, Erasmus, etc. Some of them who are actually bigger. I mean, Erasmus, you have 27 countries participating in that, so that's like the largest European academic exchange program. The German Academic Exchange Service, what's interesting, it started already in 1925 and has traditionally been the biggest in the world funded by one country. So this is just German money, and they're bringing between 70 and 80,000 foreigners back and forth every year. And I can testify, I was also a DAAD scholar, so they also funded me to come to Germany. And what's great about it is really it's just facilitating access. So they're basically saying, here's an airline ticket, here's a monthly fellowship, come to Germany, pick your own professors, pick your own classes, make friends, make enemies, think what you want to think about Germany, go home. So in that sense, really just facilitating the access. And I think that's a great model that we can maybe learn from and apply in other cases. So really where the government's job, it's government money, the German government's paying for it all, and all they're doing is facilitating the access. and the rest is up to you. And I think that seems to me like a great way of government spending money. So instead of trying to give a certain image of Germany, let people find out for themselves. You're also giving them something they need. Everyone needs education. So in that sense, it's also useful. Give me a year where I don't have to pay, tuition, etc. So anyway, so that would be an older example in 1925, but I'm calling it New School culture diplomacy because I think it really does encompass exactly this idea of facilitating access. At the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy, that's also our philosophy. In the sense, this week we're trying to facilitate access between you and each other, the different students, also between the speakers and also the students, as well as other partners. And I think that's really what we see as our job, whether it's our interns, volunteers, and staff in the office, whether it's the participants of the programs, whether it's the speakers. That's our job, facilitate access. ICD doesn't really try to be an expert in anything, even in cultural diplomacy, but we try to really bring the experts and practitioners of the field together. And again, that you make up your own mind by the end of this week, what cultural diplomacy is, what the need for it is. So that would be what I would call New School cultural diplomacy. So the final slide that I want to conclude on before we have our next lecture is a specific example of what I would call New School cultural diplomacy. I was actually just in Tel Aviv last week meeting with a fascinating organization called the Perez Center for Peace. And they did a collaboration together with Street Football World, which is a Berlin-based organization, actually using sports to bring Israelis and Palestinians together, but also beyond that. And for me, it's a fascinating example of a really tough case. Many people have really given up on Israel-Palestine. I think there's no solution. And here's one example in that context, but they also work around the world, also in Latin America, Eastern Europe, everywhere, where actually sports can serve as a vehicle for cultural diplomacy, even in cases that are actually politically impossible, where most have actually given up. They're still actually having successful projects, and I think making contributions. How limited they are in the grand scheme of things, time will tell. But it's a powerful example, and the reason why I also like this example in particular, when I first started ICD, back in 1999, I myself was skeptical of what role cultural diplomacy has in conflicts. I said, all right, if you have two countries that want to work together, two countries that like each other, two countries that are at peace, great. Academic exchange, as ambassadors, no problem. My dilemma is, what if you have a conflict? What if people are trying to eat, if they're trying to stay alive? If there are really urgent situations there, is culture even an option? Can we talk about cultural diplomacy? Is it appropriate? And I was initially very hesitant. And I said, look, I don't want to run in there and maybe cause more problems than good. So I had a lot of respect, especially for conflict situations. On the other hand, that also seems too easy. Should we just give up and let the conflicts go on? Is there no rule for cultural diplomacy? So I was always thinking, what can we do? So this is one example of what I would call indirect cultural diplomacy. It's not about bringing Israelis and Palestinians together to learn about Palestine or Israel. It's bringing them together to do something else, in this case, playing soccer. And sometimes that indirect approach is easier. It doesn't matter what's on your passport, your religion, even what language you speak. Let's do something together, whether it's playing sports, volunteering, etc. So that's the other reason why I think this is interesting. This idea of indirect cultural diplomacy. So let me show you a brief glimpse of the work of the Perez Center for Peace together with Street Football World.
My name is Rania Sulin. I'm 24 years old. I come from Israel, from Tel Aviv. I've been working at the Perez Center for Peace for 2 years now.
My name is Anwar Zidan. I'm from Palestine. We are here in a peace team that consists of Palestinians and Israelis. We came here to play soccer in the Street Football World Festival 06.
We started with 100 children, now we have 2,400 children. The Perez Center for Peace was founded in 1996 by Mr. Shimon Peres, who was the former Prime Minister of Israel and a Nobel Prize winner. His idea and his vision was to try to create joint activities and joint projects between Israelis and Palestinians, which usually never have the opportunity to meet each other except like soldiers and people, like regular people, like sports people, medicine people, doctors, economics. And the vision is really to try with the small people to make a change. We go to refugee camps in the Palestinian side, and we go to most of the south of Israel, which is less wealthy.
wanna come join the forces of my legion too. They call me Sphinx, I'm straight out of Cairo. I set the mic on fire like a maniac.
We came here especially to tell the whole world that we want to make peace, and we could make peace. And there is nothing better than sport that connect and join people together.
We take every time one Israeli village and one Palestinian village. They play like a regular after-school program twice a week. And the special thing about our program is that they meet twice a month, the two children from both sides. They play together, they learn together, they have workshops together, and we've been really experiencing great reactions from both sides.
I have a question for the world. We started with the checkpoints, now we reach to the wall, the separation wall. What will be after that? What they expect from us as a Palestinian people? How should we live? And what we will do in this big prison? What will be after that? What will be worse than this separation wall?
And my question to the Israeli government and to the Palestinian government is, why can't all the rest of the world, and why can't the both of you work together, as we've been showing to the world here in Berlin as a peace team, which has Israeli players and Palestinian players. We've been showing that we can work together as a team and have the same goals, and the same aim is to win, and to win for peace. And if you could do that as well, I think that we will live in a much better and safer place.
The video is actually done by another NGO called droppingknowledge.org. If you want to learn more about this, streetfootballworld.org also has more information. But again, I think it's a fascinating example of what I would say indirect cultural diplomacy. So even if you have two groups that normally can't meet, maybe in a normal setting or in, Jerusalem or one of the cities, let's say, within Israel or Palestine, this is another approach. Maybe bring them together somewhere else, bring them together to do something else, this idea of really joint activity. So this, again, I present to you not only because of sports, but also to get you thinking of maybe similar examples in other countries, maybe where you're also coming from, where this indirect approach might be more appropriate than direct approach. Another example would be through volunteering. We're very often also building a homeless shelter together, or really some other kind of volunteer activity can also be a great way. It doesn't matter what's on your business card, it doesn't matter what's on your passport, but really, when you're there with the power tools or really putting things together, you can very often also build some great bonds. We've done that very often with the ICD Leaders programs too. We actually helped to renovate a homeless shelter in Montreal once with our Canadian-German group. We also volunteer very often for a variety of organizations. One in Berlin is called Berliner Tafel, where they actually take food the day of the expiration date from supermarkets and immediately distribute it to homeless shelters and actually people in need in the city, and a variety of other activities. And again, it's great. Very often we'll bring the team and the interns there too. I always say through volunteering, you get much more than you give. And obviously, technically, you are giving your time, and I think we are also helping individuals in a sincere way, but you get a lot more. And I think really it's a very rewarding experience, just personally, and also in terms of building trust and understanding with the others you're volunteering with. So that would be another area where I think more research could be done in terms of maybe the future of cultural diplomacy. So that was the quick tour that I wanted to give you in terms of where cultural diplomacy came from and where we're at today. And maybe just to summarize, again, I would say the classical cultural diplomacy was primarily governmental, not only, but primarily governmental, primarily with the agenda of persuasion or winning the hearts and minds, or propaganda even in some cases, like during the Cold War. Those would be characteristics that I'd see of the classical cultural diplomacy. Characteristics that I'd see of the new school cultural diplomacy, or the future forms, would be first of all partnership. Governments together with the private sector, together with civil society. And then secondly, the mission, our suggestion should be facilitate access between the cultures, as opposed to dictating or trying to preach what your culture or your country is. So those would be the two characteristics that I would say would differentiate the past from the present and maybe the future. But there are many other examples that we'll see this week and also that you may know of cultural diplomacy. So what I'd like to do now, before we begin the second section, is see if you have any questions or comments before our final 45-minute block before lunch. Yes, and actually let me give you the microphone also make sure for the camera. Okay, please. Oh, and if you could also introduce yourselves when you speak, so we can also begin to get to know each other.
Carol, hey, I'm director for the Caribbean Tourism Organisation, which is 30 Caribbean countries working together. And seeing the film of Louis Armstrong taken decades ago made me realize that we still have a long way to come, because in it he kept saying, well, it depends on what Uncle Sam wants. In other words, he wasn't really empowered about why he was even there. And it's made me realize that with the Caribbean, we have a number of athletes and celebrities, Rihanna, Usain Bolt, I can name so many of the Caribbean people that are doing so well. But even when we work with them, sometimes they'll be like, well, I'm here for my country, but really, why are you there? And it's made me realize that even when we take all these young stars and celebrities around the world with us on tourism and promotions, and we say they're tourism ambassadors, we still need to work with them to truly understand why they're there and the real input that they can make for this whole cultural diplomacy. So just seeing that has made me realize that we still have a long way to go in empowering the people who we take out there to work with us. That was just my comment.
No, it's a very important point. And actually, especially in the Cold War period, many of these musicians didn't actually know necessarily why they were being sent here and there. For some of them, it was just a gig. And hey, good, government's paying, I'll go and play. Louis Armstrong is one of the examples I think he did understand, obviously, the broader picture and was more aware of that. Many would also say, we have an interview I'll show you in the next lecture with Wynton Marsalis, where he says that they weren't representing the government, they were representing the people of America. And that was another way sometimes the musicians were able to actually deal with that dilemma sometimes, where maybe they didn't agree with the policies of the government, etc. So I think awareness is definitely important. On the other hand, we have to be careful about that too, because if the government briefs you and says, all right, this is your mission, go, that can also be a problem. I had a good experience. The U.S. State Department sent me a number of times as part of the U.S. Embassy outreach program here in Germany to smaller cities in eastern Germany. Many of the cities who had actually never met an American. For many of these people, this is shortly after the wall came down. And fascinating experience. What I appreciated about it is that the government didn't give me any briefing. They just said, Mark, go there and talk about multiculturalism, etc. So I could criticize the government, I could say whatever I wanted. So in that sense, they didn't really give me any, let's say, information or briefing, which can also be good. So I think it goes both ways. But we do have to be aware of that. Sometimes cultures can be used, and cultural ambassadors can be used for good purposes, sometimes also bad purposes. One example we'll discuss later on also in terms of soft power. Joseph Nye usually illustrates Osama bin Laden as having really been an expert of soft power, in the sense he didn't pay anyone to fly into the World Trade Center. He didn't scare them into flying into the World Trade Center. He attracted them to his interpretation of quote-unquote religion, and that was bin Laden's soft power. So we have to also be aware it can be a risk. Cultural diplomacy is not always good. Soft power is also not always good. It very much depends who's doing it and for what purpose. So we have to look at both sides. Please.
I understand that, but I think for us as well, with the Caribbean, we like to know that people who are going out and representing our region can at least communicate. We don't always want them to be the joker, the trickster, the dancer, the player. We actually want them to have something to say as well. So while you don't want to dictate to people, you still want to have some level of awareness. You don't always... to me, looking at Louis Armstrong, who's a man I truly admire, I would still have wanted him to not only be talking about them cats. I would have still have wanted him to promote black Americans as actually having something to say, rather than just street talk about them cats. There really was more to the people even at that time, if you think of some of the other role models who were there fighting for equality for black Americans at that time. So yeah, he did a brilliant job, but I would just have preferred if he was a bit more solid, for want of a better expression. But maybe that's just me in my world.
No, but it's true. It's a question also. Can an ambassador actually represent a people? Obviously, different ambassadors representing different things. And I think there, you raised a good point. We have to be careful who we send, also where we send them, and make sure there's a match there. The other thing is also to try to somehow brief them, etc. But I think there, I just found with artists, it's better just to let them. As soon as you try to tell an artist, don't say this or say this. So, right. Or the other approach would be to bring a diversity. So you bring a variety of different cultural ambassadors, maybe a poet, maybe a musician, etc. As another way of dealing with it. Where are you from in the Caribbean, by the way? Okay, so actually, because I was just thinking of Jamaica, because Marcia Barrett, I don't know if you've heard of her, this famous group Boboni M, she's actually on our advisory board, and she lives down the street. So I can maybe see if she'll even stop by this week, because she's also an example where she really feels she's representing Jamaica, even though the vast majority of her life was actually abroad. And we did some events actually with the Jamaican tourism. So not the first time here. But all right, so we'll leave Jamaican tourism. Another question or comments before we go to the second part about cultural diplomacy in a multipolar world? Also, if really, there's no stupid questions, only stupid answers, because we have a very diverse group here. I mean, some of you may be familiar with the terms like soft power, hard power. Some of you maybe not. Cultural diplomacy. Any question is totally valid, and it's also a good way for us to get to know each other. So don't be shy. And if you could briefly introduce yourself, also.
My name is Marcus, and I'm a student at the University of Kent in Canterbury. And I was just wondering, what role do you give to religion and cultural diplomacy? Because you didn't mention it.
Yeah. No, it's very important. Traditionally, religion has not been so present in cultural diplomacy. We're trying to do more and more. My father is actually very interested in this. He's a professor of theology, and he's actually trying to put together a big project now in the US. First of all, an academic one in terms of research, really looking at the potential that he also sees for religion to actually serve as a bridge. Traditionally speaking, as we all know, religion has been a very divisive force and has tended to actually cause more problems maybe than solve. And I think that's a very negative phenomena, and many kind of give up and they say, religion is only bad or can only do harm. I also believe that I think interfaith dialogue can be very positive, in particular in difficult situations. For example, another person who's spoken a number of times at ICD is Ribal al-Assad. He's actually the cousin of the current Assad in Syria. He's been living in exile his entire life, is completely against everything that's happening there, and has been really fighting hard for human rights in Syria. The way he's doing it is through also interfaith dialogue. He has an NGO, and there he's trying to bring together Christians, Jews, Muslims for the events around the world. And so he sees that as a contribution he's trying to make to the peace process at great risk. I mean, they've tried to assassinate him a number of times, and that's an extreme situation, yes, sort of with Syria, where somebody really is taking a big risk. But there are examples there. So I haven't given up on religion. Also, for me personally, faith is also very important. But it's tricky, and I think there maybe just as a response in terms of what role there is for religion and cultural diplomacy, I would say a big role. You may have noticed ICD does every year at least 3 times a conference looking at cultural diplomacy and human rights. Also, human rights traditionally has been a very foreign field, but I think there we have to discuss human rights. If we really are serious about building trust, we've got to deal with the easy issues as well as the difficult issues. So religion, the problem with religion is ultimately speaking, there's sort of one way and the other way, and very often there isn't a middle ground or there isn't sort of a compromise. But we definitely have to at least understand where are the differences and also see where there are actually many commonalities. I wrote my thesis on the Hajj, actually, which is the Islamic tradition of pilgrimage, which is a great example in Islam where you actually have a really powerful, I would say, cultural diplomacy experience. Through this pilgrimage, you have millions of Muslims every year coming together, every nationality, every ethnicity, everything, in total peace, praying on the same rug, drinking from the same cup. So, no matter what religion it is, there are very powerful examples there. That we, I think, can learn from. So to answer your question, there's very little research on the topic. If you're interested, we can send you some articles. My father is also working with many of the people in the U.S. He taught a course also as part of our MA program last year on religion and cultural diplomacy, together with Cynthia Schneider. So we're trying there, but so far there isn't so much research. And it's basically been absent from most of the cultural diplomacy initiatives, at least governmental ones. However, in terms of NGOs, you do have many NGOs dealing with this, especially in terms of interfaith dialogue. Some at a local level, bringing, let's say, Muslims, Christians, and Jews together here in Berlin, also at an international level. But there's much more of a potential there. So if anyone's interested in writing an article or doing something for that, it would definitely be helpful. A final question or comments before we go to part 2? All right, well, if not, then let's maybe go to the next slide here. I think you have to do a start and stop, Corbett, with the video. And then tell me when you're ready. Use the opportunity to move to the second point. So what I'd like to discuss now is cultural diplomacy in a multipolar world. So this is to follow up on the first lecture, a goal of actually trying to put cultural diplomacy in the context of the world we live in now. And I want to begin by asking a fairly general question. Can culture influence the way that people think and act? You may know the answer to this, but I want to still ask the question because I think it's an important question for us to think about. If culture can influence the way that people think and act, is that a good thing or can that be a bad thing? Is that also a risk? And how can culture also have an impact? So the first thing that I want to do is show you an example that I referred to before of Wynton Marsalis and Lincoln Center and what the US State Department today is actually doing when it comes to cultural diplomacy. This particular video was taken about 1.5 years ago. And what's interesting is they're referring to Syria. So just keep in mind when you see Syria here, this is a couple years ago. So it's before we had a lot of the mass killings and the terrible horrors that are taking place today. So just keep that in mind. However, the rest of this is still very relevant for what the State Department is doing today. So again, maybe a way that music can help to build bridges. But we can discuss this video too. I have mixed feelings about the work of the State Department as well. Let's see.
The Declaration of Independence refers to a decent respect to the opinions of mankind. The winning over modern-day world opinion is precisely what some low-key citizen ambassadors are trying to do right now. Striking the right note is the key to their mission, as Tracy Smith reports now in our Sunday morning cover story.
On any given day, somewhere in the world, they're lining up to hate us. But even in places where they denounce the U.S. government is, in many cases, reaching out with music.
We had no apprehensions about presenting American music around the world.
Jazz great Wynton Marsalis is part of that effort.
They want to love our country. We have to present them a side of it that is lovable.
Soon and very soon, we are going to see the King.
And this is how the lovable side sounds.
We are going to see the King.
These singers, Oscar Williams and the Perfected Praise, are now on tour in Eastern Europe. They're just one of the music groups the U.S. State Department sends around the world every year representing America. The program, called The Rhythm Road, is a $10 million a year effort in partnership with the Jazz at Lincoln Center organization. There's no speech making, no U.S. aid handouts, just Americans performing American songs. In this kind of diplomatic mission, the music does all the talking.
For an American performer or group to come gives people a chance to, in their own imagination at least, think about what might be.
Secretary of State Hillary Clinton.
Are there times when a musician can do your job better than you can?
Well, I think that there are certainly times when music conveys American values better than a speech.
It's not a new idea. Beginning in the 1950s, the State Department sent musicians like Duke Ellington, Dizzy Gillespie, Louis Armstrong, and others to diplomatic hotspots overseas.
The interesting thing is, at that time, a lot of those guys didn't agree with the policies of our government, but they still represented our government overseas.
Right, well, because they weren't representing the government, they were representing the people. And they recognize that many times a government does not necessarily act with the will of its people.
Politics aside, the musical ambassadors played the world. By late 1961, jazz icon Dave Brubeck was a State Department tour veteran.
Dave, you've been all over the world now. Do you think that people around the world react the same way to music?
Rhythm is an international
'89, the years may have taken a little of the spring out of his step, but Dave Brubeck's belief in the power of music burns as music can shape world events. But for one brief shining moment in 1988, Dave Brubeck's jazz quartet did what mere diplomacy could not.
You actually went to Moscow. You were in Moscow when Reagan and Gorbachev...
At the summit.
At the summit. Summit. You chuckle when you say that.
Yeah, because it's so unbelievable, you know.
Brubeck has now retired from overseas touring, and in so many other ways, the world has changed. The State Department now sends music groups to places like Syria, a country on the list of state sponsors of terrorism. But where jazz was the coolest sound of the 1950s, the young target audience in Syria today calls for a totally different kind of music.
My first show home in a while. My queen's at the front of the crowd. It's good to see you, mama.
Meet Chen Lo and the Liberation Family, a hip-hop band from Brooklyn, New York.
Why would the State Department pay to send a hip-hop band overseas?
Hip-hop is America. I mean, and so is jazz, and so is every other form of music with American roots that tell a story.
When they told you that you were going to Syria, what'd you think?
Didn't know what to think, you know, at first.
Instead of a big concert hall, Chen Lo's venue was a converted restaurant in Damascus's old city, packed with curious kids. But from the opening note, it was clear that the Syrian teens liked what they heard. Some kids said the experience changed their minds about Americans.
But they think that Americans look superior from us. You know what I mean?
That Americans look down on you.
Yeah.
And these guys showed you something different?
Yeah. They were very down to earth. Nothing like that anyone ever says about Americans.
Do you feel like you connected with those people? Like, at least in that sense, for that moment, you made a difference?
No question. Definitely. The impact was felt, I think, in both ways. I know I was affected.
I know it sounds like it's very basic, but sometimes you've got to get back to basics, and we have to rebuild, you know, the image of our country, who we are as a people. We are the most incredibly diverse, successful, freedom-loving, people in the history of the world, and I want everybody to understand that.
You say it sounds a little basic. To some people, it sounds a little kumbaya, like, oh, come on, let's go to Syria and throw on a free concert and join hands in peace.
It may be a little bit hopeful, because I can't point to a change in Syrian policy because Chen Lo and the Liberation Family showed up. But I think that we have to use every tool at our disposal. So we move a lot of different pieces on the chessboard every day. It's multi-dimensional chess, if you will.
Hip-hop can be a chess piece.
Absolutely.
And maybe music can be a bridge.
Musicians we're not there to threaten anything. We're not there to take anything. We're there to give something and to bring something. We're not there to proselytize. We're there to play. And I think people understand that.
So I thought that was an interesting example, just so you can see, again, the connection between this Cold War period and today, where Americans are still using music as a way of building bridges. What I find interesting in particular about this video is, as we look at Syria now, it does make you think, did a concert like this have an effect maybe to inspire, youth to think, differently about, possible realities? And I don't know, I mean, as we look at Facebook, this and that, it's all about really giving access to different, also, images of the world and different realities. So I'd love to see, if any of the kids who are there at that concert, what they're doing today. But that aside, I think, again, this is a recent example of what actually cultural diplomacy can look like today. The second example that I'd like to show you in answering this question, can culture influence the way that people think and act, is a brief talk that Cynthia Schneider gave, where she's discussing the influence of American Idol, TV show in Afghanistan. And this actually is not an example of cultural diplomacy, but I think it is an example where something cultural can actually have an effect much beyond just entertainment or culture. And in her thesis, the Afghan equivalent, or it's called Afghan Star, is actually helping to bring democracy to Afghanistan through the TV show. So let's take a brief moment to listen to Ambassador Cynthia Schneider, once again a professor at Georgetown University, former U.S. ambassador, and her thesis of Afghan Star, bringing democracy to Afghanistan.
I'd like to ask you, what do these three people have in common? Well, you probably recognize the first person. I'm sure you're all avid American Idol watchers. But you might not recognize Ida Al-Jahani, who is a contestant, indeed a finalist, in the Poet of the Millions competition, which is broadcast out of Abu Dhabi and seen throughout the Arab world. In this contest, people have to write and recite original poetry in the Nabati form of poetry, which is a traditional Bedouin form. And Lima Sahar was a finalist in the Afghan Star singing competition. Now, before I go any further, yes, I know it all began with Britain's Got Talent. But my point in discussing this is to show you, I hope I'll be able to show you how these merit-based competitions with equal access to everyone, with the winner selected by voting via SMS, are changing tribal societies. And I'm going to focus on Afghanistan and the Arab world with the UAE, how they're changing tribal societies, not by introducing Western ideas, but by being integrated into the language in those places. It all begins with enjoyment. These programs are reaching incredibly deeply into society. In Afghanistan, people go to extraordinary lengths to be able to watch this program. And you don't necessarily have to have your own TV set. People watch it all over the country, also in public places. But it goes beyond watching, because also part of this is campaigning. People become so engaged that they have volunteers, just like political volunteers anyway, who fan out over the countryside campaigning for their candidate. The contestants also put themselves forward. Now, and of course, there's a certain degree of ethnic allegiance, but not entirely, because each year the winner has come from a different tribal group. This has opened up the door particularly for women, and in the last season there were 2 women in the finalists. One of them, Lima Sahar, is a Pashtun from Kandahar, a very conservative part of the country. And here she relates in the documentary film Afghan Star how her friends urged her not to do this and told her that she was leaving them for democracy. But she also confides that she knows that members of the Taliban are actually SMSing votes in for her. Ida al-Jahani also took risks and put herself out to compete in the Poet of the Millions competition. I have to say her husband backed her from the start, but her tribe and family urged her not to compete and were very much against it. But once she started to win, then they got behind her again. It turns out that competition and winning is a universal human value. And she's out there, her poetry is about women and the life of women in society. So just by presenting herself and being in competition with men, this shows the voting on the program, it sets a very important example for young women. These are young women in the audience of the program in Abu Dhabi, but also people in the viewing audience. Now, you'd think that American Idol would introduce a measure of Americanization, but actually just the opposite is happening. By using this engaging popular format for traditional local culture, it actually in the Gulf is precipitating a revival of interest in Nabati poetry, also in traditional dress and dance and music. And for Afghanistan, where the Taliban banned music for many years, it is reintroducing their traditional music. They don't sing pop songs, they sing Afghan music. And they also have learned how to lose gracefully without avenging the winner. And no small thing. And the final sort of formulation of this American Idol format, which has just appeared in Afghanistan, is a new program called The Candidate. And in this program, people present policy platforms that are then voted on. Many of them are too young to run for president, but by putting the issues out there, they are influencing the presidential race. So for me, the substance of Things Unseen is how reality TV is driving reality. Thank you.
So again, I thought that was an interesting example, not of cultural diplomacy, but how something cultural can also have an effect beyond just culture. And again, this is something just to make a mental note of as we're trying to think of how one can have an impact on situations around the world. Maybe again, indirectly, there are possibilities that we aren't aware of. So that's what I think is interesting about that example, so that I think culture definitely can influence the way that people think and act. Here it's as easy as just this SMS voting. You know, if Afghanistan, you don't have internet coverage so much around the country, but almost everyone has at least one cell phone, if not two, similar to many countries also in Africa. So in that sense, the accessibility, men, women, everyone can actually participate in this. So it really is much more than just a TV show. So anyway, I thought that was an interesting example. Those were the two sort of answers that I wanted to give you, or examples, in answering the question, can culture influence the way that people think and act? And I think basically it can. The question is how, and if that's always a good thing. What I'd like to ask now is a second question. Is there a need for culture diplomacy? If so, when and where? This lecture is titled Culture Diplomacy in a Multipolar World. And I just want us to think for a moment, you know, what is the need for culture diplomacy? We were discussing in the first lecture about how culture diplomacy of the past was kind of propaganda persuasion. You know, this let's win the hearts and minds of foreign audiences, let's make others like us. And is that really useful today? You know, if we agree that it's a multipolar world, if we agree it's an interdependent world, you know, is that really going to be so helpful if France is telling us how great French culture is and Spain is telling us how great Spanish culture is? I don't think that's really going to make a contribution to the global society that we're in. So therefore, I think there must be some other need. And that's kind of the question I want to reflect with you for a few moments about. And I want to do so by sharing 3 quotes with you from different experts across the field that get us thinking, I think, in different directions. First quote I want to share with you is from a famous American political scientist I'm sure we've all heard of. He wrote an article in 1993 in Foreign Affairs and later on a book with the same title. Samuel Huntington, his famous book, Clash of Civilizations. Whether you like this book or not, the reason why I wanted to share with you his central thesis is I think it, unfortunately, has had a great impact around the world. And I think many people do actually see the world this way. Many people do think that we're in a clash of civilizations right now. And that's why I think it is important for us just to reflect on this and try to make some sense of it. So Huntington says the following: "It is my hypothesis that the fundamental source of conflict in this new world will not be primarily ideological or primarily economic. The great divisions among humankind and the dominating source of conflict will be cultural. Nation-states will remain the most powerful actors in world affairs, but the principal conflicts of global politics will occur between nations and groups of different civilizations. The clash of civilizations will be the battle lines of the future." So basically, I guess the 2 challenges or main challenges that I have with his thesis is, first of all, the use of the word civilization. For me, it's just too big of a word. I mean, basically what he does, for those of you who read his book, the first 20 pages, he gives sort of different maps of the world in different periods of time. And his map of contemporary civilization or world, he talks about, for example, Islamic civilization, where he groups together all the different interpretations of the Quran, no matter if they're linked to politics or not, and that's Islamic world. He then talks about Western civilization, where he groups together all the countries that he considers Western, also as one. As we know, you know, with Islam, there's a tremendous diversity, many different interpretations of the Quran, and very different political contexts. So for me, it doesn't make any sense to group that all together into one when you really have so many big differences within that community. The same goes, I would say, for Western civilization. As we saw also in the previous administration, there are many cases where the West didn't agree on a lot of big issues. So again, that's my first problem with Huntington, sort of the use of the word civilization. Where I prefer culture, in terms of cultural diplomacy, is you have more flexibility. Culture can be a big word, talking about youth culture or Facebook culture, or it can be a very specific culture, talking about, you know, Kreuzberg Berlin culture, or hip-hop culture, or American culture. There are many different ways we can zoom in and zoom out. So that's why I kind of prefer culture. You have a little bit more flexibility. Civilizations, you're kind of just trapped in this big, bulky word, and I think it just tends to maybe mislead more than to help when we try to make sense of the world we're living in. So that's my first challenge with Huntington. Second challenge is he's fairly pessimistic. So saying, you know, the clash of civilizations will be the battle lines of the future. Many thought that September 11th was the beginning of this new clash of civilizations. You know, the axis of good versus the axis of evil, the crusade, you know, all these big words that were used by the former American administration. And it's a problem in the sense, I think there are many Americans still today who think that we're in a clash of civilization, and it's us against them, and they really put a blanket, over all of the Islamic world or Arab world, depending how one wants to generalize it. Very often you could say people like bin Laden did the same, and also, it's us versus them, and again, these kind of ultimate generalizations. And unfortunately, I think they're also not the only ones who think this way. So I think we just have to be aware of the fact that I think, especially if we look at today's TV society, media society, it's sort of forcing us almost to make generalizations where we shouldn't make generalizations. We want the soundbite. We want to simplify. We don't want to have to worry about all the different factors or get to know all of the diversity. We want to be able to say, okay, we're the good guys, they're the bad guys, and sort of our society in many ways is moving us in that direction. To the point of religion, religion then also can be a great way of manipulating people, and then using the right vocabulary, getting people thinking, touching that nerve can also be a great way of getting them to cooperate, as the previous administration actually did, in terms of, again, the words like crusade and this and that. I mean, this was intentional language being used for certain reasons. So without giving you a big sort of explanation of Huntington, this thesis I think is important because it has influenced, I think, the way that many people are thinking, and also it does summarize a school of thought that is very present actually in not only foreign policies but also national policies of many countries in the world. The other thing I guess we could take from Huntington in a positive way, as you could maybe the lesson learned from Huntington, is that it's a risk if you have entire regions of the world that don't have any dialogue, understanding, or trust. And I think there he's right. I think that is a risk. So let's say we won't call it a civilization. Let's say there's the Middle East region where we learned on September 11th, actually, the Americans didn't really have much dialogue. They didn't really have much understanding. And of course, they didn't have trust with these regions. And I think that awareness is an important awareness. And I think many Americans and also many around the world recognize that now. So cultural diplomacy still isn't mainstream. It's still not a big priority for any government, aside from the Germans, which are doing a lot with cultural diplomacy. But I think the awareness is there. I think people are realizing, okay, there is actually more to the story than just the politics and the economics. So that's one maybe positive contribution that Huntington did help with in terms of bringing the focus there to these cultural issues and these gaps where you had really certain parts of the world that had no exchange or dialogue with other parts of the world. So Huntington is an important reference point for us to keep in mind when we talk about the multipolar world we live in today. Second quote I'd like to share with you is from a terrorism expert, Walter Lacour. He, at the time, was the co-chair of the International Research Council at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington when he said this. I believe it was in 2002. And this is his perspective of the world we live in today. Far from being on the verge of a new order, the world has entered a period of great disorder. In facing these new dangers, a re-examination of old priorities is needed. Cultural diplomacy in the widest sense has increased in importance, whereas traditional diplomacy and military power are of limited use in coping with most of these dangers. So what he's referring to here is terrorism. And as we all know, terrorism is a very difficult challenge to overcome. It's not linked necessarily to any certain regional space, not linked necessarily to any government. It can happen anywhere. In the case of September 11th, it was actually American commercial planes that were actually used. It wasn't even military planes. So what he's trying to point out here is militarily, not so many options. Okay, if you can find out actually who attacks you, one can respond militarily, and maybe that's appropriate, maybe not, in the sense of self-defense. But the key thing is, can you even find, where these attacks are coming from? Second problem is also, even if you can find them, even if you attack the one group of terrorists who attacked you, how are you going to prevent it from happening again? Can you build a big force field over each country and block every influence from the outside? Can you just get more guns and missiles to just shoot down any commercial plane that comes too close? What do you do? And I think do you build a wall, like in the case of Israel and Palestine, and just forcefully separate people? Not so many options. I mean, some are there, but I think it's clear that I think something is missing there. And I don't want to say cultural diplomacy can end terrorism, but I do think there's some sort of a connection there. And I think the more cultural diplomacy that you have, the more dialogue, the more exchange, the more trust, hopefully the less likely there is the possibility for terrorism. I don't think we can reach the Osama bin Ladens in the world, but maybe we can reach a much larger group, let's say moderate Muslims, before they decide, should I go this way, should I go that way, by offering them economic opportunities, jobs, cultural opportunities, education, all kinds of things. So I think there, just as one example, something can be done. And I think even though terrorism is maybe one of the biggest, if not the biggest, international challenge that seems so hopeless to actually stop, I think cultural diplomacy should be considered. And when governments or when politicians are making decisions about what kind of a comprehensive strategy are we going to have to try to create a more stable planet for us to live in, I would argue cultural diplomacy should be at least part of that strategy. And I think can, over time, bring us to a situation where terrorism is less likely to occur. So I just wanted to make that connection for you, and I'll leave it there to let you think about that. Because it is a big connection to make, and I'm doing so cautiously, because I recognize it's so difficult to handle these issues. But I think some contributions can be made in that sense. The final quote that I wanted to share with you summarizes, I think, very much the current situation that we're now in. This is actually from a scholar, Benjamin Barber. You may have heard of him, American scholar, has written a number of books, most famous now for his thesis of interdependence. He actually also started a tradition September 12th every year. He started in September of 2002, the year after September 11th, I believe. And actually every year since then has been doing the celebration of global interdependence. His main thesis is the following. The old aspiration was independence, the new reality, interdependence. So what he's saying here is for a long time, countries said, all right, our goal is to be independent. Once we're independent, story's over, we've succeeded, we can move on. And Barber is saying, look, independence is great. Fight for it, do what you have to do, whether it's United States, Latin American countries, African countries, it's great to be independent. As soon as you're independent, however, you have to very quickly realize you actually live in an interdependent world. And as much as you want to be free and do your own thing and not worry about anyone else, you have to worry about everyone else. And to solve the key challenges that are actually facing all of us, the only chance we have is to work together. And he summarizes it in the following way. Every challenge we face today, from climate and crime to technology and markets and communications and public health, is global in character. Yet the institutions of democracy we rely on to address these challenges are still locked up inside sovereign states pursuing the old logic of independence. But in an interdependent world of diseases without borders, we also need citizens without borders, democracy without borders, which means if we are to survive interdependence and flourish in liberty, we must either globalize democracy or democratize globalization. So for me, I think Barber is right. I also think we do live in an interdependent world. For me, the easiest example of that is climate change. Many scientists think it's already too late. Those who are optimistic and think that we actually can do something to prevent climate change and the terrible things that will actually come with it, they agree we can't wait until tomorrow or next year or 10 years from now. We have to start today. And they also agree it can't just be one country. It has to be many countries, ideally all countries. So that's the easiest example for me of a challenge that really can't be tackled by one country independently, only interdependently. So for me, I think it's helpful to look at the multipolar world we live in today as an interdependent world. And if you agree with that, then I would encourage you to agree with the next statement, that actually the biggest challenge or the biggest goal of diplomacy is actually to foster cooperation. In the sense if diplomacy is successful, then there'll be more cooperation, any kind of cooperation, economic cooperation, climate change cooperation, terrorism cooperation, in the sense anti-terrorism cooperation, but it can go the other way as well in terms of global networks. But I think that's the main goal, the main task of diplomacy. So I would argue for culture diplomacy, when we come back to my original question, what is the need for culture diplomacy? I would say also to help enable more collaboration. So as I said in the first lecture, let's try to educate, enhance, and sustain relationships, not with the goal necessarily of persuading them or getting them to like us, just the goal of having understanding and trust. And I think that would be a great contribution that culture diplomacy, I think, can make. Let's bring the people to the table, get that bridge there, get them trusting each other, and then leave it to them. Let the Germans and the Turks and the Chinese decide what they want to do with that bridge. But let's at least make sure we get them there in a peaceful, respectful way so that they trust each other and they understand each other. And that's, I think, where culture diplomacy would end, and then the policies of the governments and the citizens would then take shape. And I think that's where it's really important that culture diplomacy always stays neutral. ICD, as you guys saw from the website, we're non-governmental, we're non-partisan, we're non-profit, and that's also part of our effort to really always try to free ourselves. Our focus is the bridges themselves, not actually what gets done with the bridges. Obviously, we're in favor of positive things. We call it Institute for Cultural Diplomacy, so we're in favor of also cultural diplomacy. We are against conflict. In that sense, you could argue we have some sort of an agenda, even though we're neutral in every sense. But that's the main point. So I think to conclude sort of this section of sort of cultural diplomacy in the multipolar world, I did want to sort of paint this picture for you that this is really an interdependent world. And I think if you agree with that, and I'd love to debate it with you right now, how should our policies for cultural diplomacy change? And how can we be responsible also as global citizens in an interdependent world when also doing cultural diplomacy? And for me, it becomes easier to understand my suggestion to you earlier that really new school cultural diplomacy is just facilitating access. Nothing more, not dictating the access, not telling people what to think, just facilitating access. And I would argue if every country of the world did a lot of cultural diplomacy and spent a lot of money on cultural diplomacy, and that was the only goal, I think the world would be a better place. And then I would be less afraid. I mean, some people would say, oh no, governments shouldn't get involved, they have their agendas, this and that. But for me, it's no problem. Governments can spend as much money as they want. If it's only facilitating access, why not? And in that sense, we, the citizens, decide what we do with that access and what we think of this issue and that issue. So I think there's a big potential, and I think that might be one way of putting together some of the points we discussed in the first lecture. What is the role of the public sector? What is the role of the private sector? What is our role as citizens? Is it enough for us just to go to work every day and go home and relax with our families? Or should we do more? Should we just be concerned with our families, or should we also be concerned with our neighbors? And if there is some sort of a responsibility to those who are not our direct family and this and that, what is that responsibility? And what can we as citizens actually do to give to society as well as also take from society? And I think that's an issue that I'd love to reflect with you too. What responsibility do you think we have? Or can we just delegate it and say, this is for the governments, we pay taxes, or this is for the private sector, they're earning profits, they should also be giving back. What is our own social responsibility, so to speak, as citizens, and what role can we play in this process? We were discussing earlier the Caribbean, what should we as, let's say, Caribbean citizens do? Should we wait for the government to select, this and this artist to go abroad, or should we just go abroad? And maybe when we give a concert, say a few words ahead of time on behalf of our country. These are interesting questions, and there's, again, not one answer, but I think there's a huge potential for creativity here in terms of our roles. And even more interesting is really with partnership. And I think that's where ICD sees the biggest future of cultural diplomacy in the multipolar world, when you bring things together, when you get the Turkish government working with the Israeli government, on an issue, for example, or the both private sectors and both citizens, even in difficult cases, difficult relationships. Let's try to get all the parties together, if possible. It might not be possible. And there are some cases where you have to actually leave the governments because for political reasons it's not possible. And then the citizens can do more. So again, each relationship has its own challenges and its own opportunities, but I think some sort of a combination of these different strategies can help. So before we launch our final discussion now in terms of your questions and also your comments, I wanted to just put one more time on the screen the official definition that I'm offering you for cultural diplomacy, and I'm hoping that over the last 40 minutes or so, I maybe have confused you a little bit and maybe stretched your mind in terms of the different things that could be cultural diplomacy, depending on what our goals are. And this maybe we'll wrap it up once again for simplicity. Cultural diplomacy, the exchange of ideas, information, art, and other aspects of culture among nations and their peoples to foster mutual understanding. So I'll leave it up on the screen. I'd be very happy now to take your questions and comments.